Hi, this is Panel Beater and this is the podcast of Triple R's Radiotherapy, a weekly radio show dedicated to health, medicine and well-being, broadcast live on Triple R from Melbourne, Australia every Sunday. Hope you enjoy the podcast and feel free to get in touch with us via Radiotherapy's Facebook page. It's Panel Beater here with my dear colleagues, Dr. Sharma and Dr. Neo. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning to you. It's nice to be called dear on a Sunday morning.
Yeah, it's quite familiar. It's what happens when we're all out in the studio together.
That's right. It all shifts up. Good to see you in the studio. It still does have a sense of novelty about it. I know this is our third, I think, where the three of us have been back.
Yeah. But, I'm normally set up in my front room trying to block out all the sound from the street and using a terrible microphone. This is luxury. What's
the latest from the front line, guys?
After you, Dr. Neo.
Oh, look, not much. Work as usual. Everyone's busy at the moment. It seems like everyone is sick at the moment as well.
Yeah.
Everyone's always a bit understaffed. Everyone's tired. Everyone's sick. It just seems like all the colds that we'd managed to avoid for the past year and a half have gone crazy over the past few weeks.
My what would you call it? My metric on public health in that respect, everybody's sick respect, is student attendance and requests for extension on assignments yes. And the grounds for which they ask them. And there's something going on.
Yeah.
Look, I've certainly had a few requests for medical exemption for extensions, yes, in my general practice. So I say your measures and my measures are lining up.
You're getting med certificates.
Oh, absolutely, medical certificates. Yeah. And, at the end of the day, the COVID we've eliminated, the virus is gone, but the lack of social distancing, well, you're going to see all the other illnesses, gastro and rhinoviruses, etc.
And it was interesting with gastro where I think a lot of people had gone from washing their hands with soap and water to washing their hands with hand sanitizer, and that's exactly what some of the gastro bugs love, because they're not broken down by hand sanitizer and only broken down by soap and water. That's
right. So when you have like a norovirus outbreak, you just need to go to town to clean absolutely everything to burst those, to destroy those viruses. Without it, no chance.
Hey, we've got a cracker of a show. But, as if we don't.
It's just, we've just got this endless streak of just banger after banger. Today's no exception. We've got a great guest on today.
Yeah, working backwards in terms of the scheme of things, we're going to end up having a bit of a chat about what's going down in India, aren't we?
That's right. It's it's difficult to ignore what's going on. There's a very, I suppose, salient Australian connection that we have because of everything with the border bans, etc. And I think specifically for Victoria, I think probably the largest migrant population we've had in the last decade has been people from India. So it's hard to see or find someone Indian in Victoria who has not been affected in terms of their family.
That's right.
Back in India from COVID.
Yeah, and I think just in the last 2 or 3 days we had some people test negative, then positive, then negative, or mixed reports about getting on the plane and coming back. And
we'll unpack all of that.
Yeah, we will.
I was just reading about it in the news today. It's really shocking stuff. Really? Total mess.
Total mess. But our special guest, Dr. Sharma.
Yes, we will be very shortly joined by Dr. Stephen Duckett of the Grattan Institute because we will be discussing all things budget, health budget, that is.
Health budget. And no shortage there. I mean, some big dollars being splashed around.
Huge, enormous sums. And I think it's going to be interesting to get Stephen's thoughts on if this is enough.
Yeah.
And I think I kind of know what the answer to that is. Yeah. But also I'm interested to hear his thoughts on not just a matter of dollars, but how we are actually spending that dollar. Are we getting value for money?
The distribution. Absolutely. Really looking forward to it.
This is a podcast from Triple R, an independent media organisation in Melbourne, Australia. To find out more about Triple R or to explore many more shows, podcasts, articles, videos and interviews, head to the Triple R website at rrr.org.au.
This week, the federal budget was unveiled and it divided us, as it always does, into winners and losers, crudely. But with the health budget, I think that's a little bit more difficult of a distinction to make because it has been boosted by several $1 billion. But as always, the devil's in the detail, and to help us pass these details, we are joined by Professor Dr. Stephen Duckett, a health economist and director of the health program at the Grattan Institute. Now, Stephen will be well known to a lot of our listeners. He's led several evidence-based innovations and reforms in areas ranging from introduction of activities-based funding for hospitals and systems of accountability for safety of hospital care. So, Stephen, have we got you on the line?
You've got me on the line. Thanks very much.
Excellent. We are so pleased to have you here. Now, Stephen, before we dip into the specifics of policies of the big key area expenditures of COVID and aged care and mental health, I was wondering if we could just start with your big picture view. What is a feeling you got out of this budget? Did it fill you with optimism? Did it satisfy you? Or was it enough? Bit of a loaded question, I know.
Yeah. So the answer is all of the above. Because, the first thing is when you hear these huge numbers, $18 billion to be invested in aged care, for example, you've got to remember that there's the politician's trick that they multiply the real amount of money being spent by some factor, and so it sounds even bigger. So in reality, when the government says $18 billion is spent on aged care, what they really mean is there's $5.5 billion a year being spent on aged care. It's still a huge sum of money, but it's not quite the same. That's the first point. The second point is, as you said correctly, the devil is in the detail. And for some of these things, we actually don't know what's going to happen because we don't know, for example, what a new Aged Care Act is going to look like, what a new deal between the states and the Commonwealth on mental health would look like. So we don't know actually what's going to happen. And thirdly, of course, it's never going to be enough because the backlog in both aged care and mental health is so huge that it was always going to be disappointing, I think.
Now, interesting you mentioned backlog because that's one of the things that the government's saying they're committed to clearing, which is, if someone's got aged care needs, and you want to be given some care at home, you're allocated in theory these packages, but the wait list for these packages is just absolutely enormous. This backlog. So, the kind of spending that they're promising is it looking like it's going to clear this backlog?
So the backlog at the moment is more than 100,000 people. They actually allocated 80,000 packages. And one of the problems with what they've done in the past on allocating packages is they've allocated level 1 and 2 packages, which are generally not enough for most people, rather than level 3 and 4. Now, they've been better this time, although they actually haven't published in the budget how many level 4, how many level 3, and so on. But so there's usually they allocate a package, but it's usually not enough. So not only do we have not enough packages, 100,000 on waiting list, 80,000 packages, but they're probably not going to be the right sort of packages. Stephen
Duckett, it's panel beater here. Could you just talk us through the differentiation between those levels for our listeners, please?
Yeah, so there are 3 aged care support programs. One is called the Commonwealth Home Support Program, and that's for meals and cleaning and gardening and those sorts of things. Then there's the next level is called the home care packages, and they come in four levels. Level 1, I think, is about 9,000 of support a year, up to level 4, which is about 50,000 of support a year. And then you can get residential aged care. What the Royal Commission on Aged Care says is we should have one continuous program that scopes in all of those 3. What the Commonwealth government said in the budget was the first 2, the 2 home-based programs, will be merged together, and we're probably going to try and have an integrated assessment program for all of them. But again, we've got to see what that actually means.
So are we basically saying that on the back of the Royal Commission, where so much was found to be lacking, the money that we're now hearing about for this coming out of this budget is really still in catch-up mode? We haven't jumped ahead at all?
That's exactly right. So the Royal Commission said there was a $10 billion shortfall. We at Grattan said it's somewhere between $7 billion and $10 billion a year. What the Commonwealth put in the budget was $5.5 billion a year. About half of that, 2.5 or so resi care and 2.5 or so home care. And that is not enough by anybody's assessment.
Stephen, one of the things that's fascinated me about the way that we've spent the money in aged care in this budget is a lot of it is tied up for specific purposes. So, X amount of money is supposed to go to packages, Y amount of money is supposed to go for training and workforce. But then there's also this basic daily fee, and that's been increased per kind of resident in aged care facilities by $10 a day. And it really kind of got me thinking that it just seems to be this kind of blanket fee that's going to all providers for all aged care residents. Is the sector really struggling that much? Like, are we, is it really the case that they genuinely need more money, or all these operators, or is it just some who are struggling? And I'm just trying to gauge your thoughts as an economist about how efficient this is.
So the Royal Commission recommended that $10 uplift. There are lots of other things that were recommended as well, like more minutes of care. The government put in a requirement of 200 minutes, and the Royal Commission wanted that to be a bit higher. The issue is we really don't know enough about how aged care providers are spending their money. So what we know, in the olden days, before the current Aged Care Act, before 1997, the funding was split into care funding and support funding like meals and cleaning and paying for the building and so on for residential aged care. And you couldn't move money from care funding into your profits, that the care funding was for care funding. Now, that was abolished, and what happened was providers were awarded for skimping on care. They could move money out of care money into their profits or into leasing and so on. And this was for both not-for-profits and for-profits, incidentally. So putting an extra $10 per day in for the good providers is going to be really good. They can actually increase the quality of care they're providing, but for the unscrupulous providers, there's no accountability. So we won't know whether accountability is going to be increased until we see the detail of the new Aged Care Act.
So essentially, there's no regulations to stop providers putting that $10 a day directly into the pockets of...
I can buy an even bigger Maserati and pay off with another $10 a day.
Good God.
You're alluding to that, the mixed market. We've got the not-for-profit and the for-profit. What is revealing in that distinction as far as the budget response is concerned?
Well, the evidence of... I want to make clear that you can have some really good for-profit providers and some really poor not-for-profit providers. I might declare an interest. I'm on the board of a not-for-profit provider, the Brotherhood of St Lawrence. So, I don't want to say for-profit bad, not-for-profit good, or vice versa. But what we really need is absolute transparency, absolute clarity on if the money is going to be paid for care, it actually has to go for care rather than being siphoned away into something else. And also, we need, and the government has done this in the budget, said that in a couple of years' time, you'll be able to look up on a website how many minutes of care is being provided in that nursing home. There's going to be a so-called star rating system.
And Stephen, look, I think that there's a really strong case for all of that. But I guess my concern is also that for some of the standards that are breached, that are transgressed, which we do, I suppose, have transparency over, we've still seen the regulator be quite soft in terms of sanctions and just the stringency with which they've gone to the extent of actually inspecting these aged care homes and then the measures they've kind of imposed against them. So I think to this end, we've also heard that a couple of $100 million is being invested further into the regulator, into the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission. So what do you think? Is that what the issue is there? Are we likely to see better functioning with this money, or do we need a new instrument?
Well, the Royal Commission said the Commission, the regulator, had totally and completely failed and we should throw it out and start again. So I'm not sure that investing more money is the right thing to do. And the other point I'd make is this. The regulator has a set of standards which are called outcome standards And they are just so waffly that it is often sometimes hard to hold people to account and to actually say, these are the standards we expect. So I think we've got to, we've got to go to a totally different system. What I believe is that you've got to be much closer geographically to these nursing homes so you can pop in quickly, so you can actually see them, so you can actually assess them regularly with visits and so on. And so at the moment, we've got a very remote regulator where all the decisions are taken in Canberra, and I just don't think that's the right model.
I think it might be alluding to the fact that a lot of these quote-unquote inspections were literally done by phone call a lot of the time to see if their infection prevention control was up to scratch.
And you've also got a tick box where you just have to tick this, tick that, tick the other, and it just doesn't give you a good feel for what the service is really, really like.
Stephen, I'd like to turn some attention towards a few of the points that the government didn't accept from the Royal Commission. So, for example, the government said that it would only give further consideration to a recommendation for mandatory minimum qualifications for personal care workers. So basically that means that a lot of our carers in aged care facilities don't even have a Certificate 3, which is a 6-month qualification. Why? What's the reasoning behind this? I struggle to understand why they would allow such unskilled workers to look after such a vulnerable population.
So I'm with you. The level of complexity of people in resi care has increased dramatically over the last decade, and we should actually be expecting that everybody in resi care, all the staff in resi care, have a Certificate 3. At the moment, about 70% do, but we should be saying this is a requirement that you may not necessarily have it the day you start, but within 6 months of employment or something, your employer helps you upgrade so you've actually got this qualification. Now, to give the government their due, then they said, OK, what we're going to do, rather than saying everybody has to have it and have a minimum standard, what they said is we're going to provide once-off 30,000 places to upskill people. Well, that's, really one of the most stupid policies, as if they assume that no one is ever going to leave, and you don't have to think about the pipeline. But that they got some good publicity about that as part of their workforce strategy. So I think the government didn't go with a compulsory one because they couldn't get their head around the idea that you could actually phase this in and to say you don't have to, because I think they were worried that if you set a Cert 3, then people couldn't get jobs and so on. But I think there are ways around that.
Now, just to switch track to another aspect of the health budget, a fair bit of spending on mental health and suicide prevention expenditures. So in terms of suicide, there's a lot of expenditures on crisis care and especially aftercare, which we'd love to see, I think, as a general practitioner myself. But also a lot of funding towards these new adult mental health centres, which is, I think, essentially to increase access for people to psychologists, but there's no kind of psychiatrist overview there. I'm just wondering, firstly, overall, any thoughts on the mental health expenditure in this budget?
So again, it's about $1 billion extra a year when fully implemented, and there's 30-something separate initiatives. So it's a pretty scattergun approach, and also this is one of the ones where they said we've got to talk to the states as well. But if I take that adult mental health initiative, the so-called Head to Health, one of the problems with that is it's a disintegrated approach. What you really want to do is make sure that whatever the Commonwealth does and whatever the state does and whatever is happening in private practice, it all works seamlessly together. And I think just helicoptering in 8 Head to Health centres really doesn't sound like an integrated solution or indeed a systematic solution to these problems.
Stephen, one of the things that caught my eye about the mental health package was something conspicuous by its absence, and that was addressing the cost and the Medicare rebate aspect of things. After the rebate, I think it's generally around about $100 for a session, and that hasn't been addressed. Did that catch your eye?
Yeah, well, the whole issue of how all of these initiatives work with MBS funding was completely and utterly ignored. So you've got problems of all kinds. That is, we know there's excessive spending on some aspects of fee-for-service. You've got evidence now that this better outcomes, better access program drove increases in out-of-pockets. The psychologists just put up their fees. So we really should be stepping back and say, look, we've got a whole budget envelope here. When we throw in what the Commonwealth is doing, what the state is doing, what the MBS is doing, that we ought to be stepping back and saying, how do we get the best value for money? How do we get the best access? How do we ensure people can get the care they need when they need it? And at the moment, you've got waiting times and I think money that's poorly invested.
Yeah, that's right. I know anecdotally in my circle, somebody was sorting out a mental health care plan recently, and they had one in the past, wanted to go back to the same psychologist that they had seen about 12 months prior, and just 2 or 3 weeks ago they were told they weren't going to be able to get an appointment until August. And that kind of seems very revealing about where things are at.
And this is a private psychologist. I mean, it's not so-called public sector problems that we're dealing with here.
Absolutely. Look, Stephen, the other kind of thought I had was actually just talking more broadly about this issue of, I suppose, a rebate, just kind of pushing this kind of price up. We've seen similar things in NDIS, obviously seeing it with kind of private psychology as well. In terms of aged care, are there any measures the government is looking at or should look at to effectively have some kind of price control or price advice? Like, how do we know this extra money is not just going to lead them to saying, oh, well, with these increased demands, we need to kind of raise our prices up more? What are the levers available there?
And this is a big issue because the home care packages are a complete rort because the providers take sometimes 30% off the top for, inverted commas, the management fee. Sometimes the management fee is twice or three times what the cost of the services is. And so, we're investing a whole lot of money in a completely and utterly broken system. Now, I would want to put in, say, 40,000 places into this broken system, but you've got to move very quickly to get much better accountability and much better standards, and saying, look, you're not going to be allowed to have 35% management fees. You're not going to be allowed to have outrageous flag falls when people aren't using much of a service. So we've got to actually totally redesign the aged care system, and there's no sign that the government was up for that in the budget.
Stephen, you've been really generous with your time, and we'll let you go very, very shortly, but we probably can't finish up without just getting some of your thoughts about where COVID itself fits in all of this. And, we were perhaps looking for some, detail about the vaccine rollout and even vaccine development here in Australia. That detail seems to be lacking. Yeah,
so basically the vaccine rollout has been a complete and utter train wreck on every dimension you could possibly imagine. There's probably nothing that has gone right with it, and there's anecdote after anecdote that I could recount. But what we really need to do is for the government to actually start disclosing, start being transparent. How many doses are being produced by CSL? How many doses are coming into the country, Pfizer doses? And so on, how many coming into the country, so we know what the performance of the vaccine rollout is. Because critically, we've got to get a very large proportion of the population vaccinated so we can start opening the borders to restore the economy in terms of international students, international tourists and the hospitality sector.
Touching on some of those same themes we were talking about with aged care, without that transparency, it's very difficult to have any kind of accountability and some progress. We are so lucky to be joined by you, Dr. Stephen Duckett. Thank you so much for your time today.
Pleasure. Thanks very much.
We've been speaking with Dr. Stephen Duckett, talking us through the budget that came down in Australia on Tuesday.
This is a podcast from Triple R, an independent media organisation in Melbourne, Australia. Triple R is listener-supported radio and receives no direct government funding. If you would like to financially support Triple R by donating or becoming a subscriber, hit up the Triple R website to find out how.
Dr. Sharma Dr. Neo, India's going a little bit nuts with COVID at the moment.
It has been
in a number of different ways.
Yeah, it's quite right, and we'll cover all the different ways. There's nuance to that word that you've just used, and it's been going on for quite some time now. This surge is just absolutely sustained, and I think even when the world was woken up to this, roughly 3-4 weeks ago now, it was obvious that it's going to rage on for quite some time. The kind of effect that we might expect to see in an Australian surge with a bit of social distancing, etc., those timeframes just don't apply when the numbers of COVID cases are actually at least 3 to 4 times worse than what official numbers can possibly show.
So let's just set the scene. So as I not terribly flippantly said, world's largest democracy, and I think this matters. So we're not talking about an authoritarian state and what that might mean for a public health response. There's that to factor in. We're talking about a massive population. We're talking about an environment with lots of movement between rural and regional and urban centres, lots of human mobility going on just in the due course of life. And, of course, we're dealing with a whole range of socioeconomic factors. We've got class, we've got religion, we've got ethnic tensions, and we've got a government that is nationalist populist, and that tells us a lot, right?
All those things factor in, and a lot of the factors you've mentioned are, I suppose we could say, difficult to change at short notice. And yet, I think the real crux of the issue is some of them are not. Deciding which government to elect and the individual decisions of specific politicians, those are decisions that are binary and that can be taken at any given point. So, I think stepping back and looking at what's happened to India, every country in the world almost has had some kind of a surge. So it's not to say that we expect perfection in this incredibly large country that's encumbered by its own socioeconomic bureaucratic issues, but that doesn't mean that there weren't better decisions that could have been made that could have blunted the effect of the surge, perhaps even prevented the surge in the first place.
So I guess what is at the forefront of my mind is why now? Like why, 18 months into this pandemic is India experiencing such a massive surge when at a time when other countries who have had difficulties with the pandemic, such as the United States, are getting on top of things?
So to me, there's a couple of factors to consider. Actually, the third factor to consider is we actually don't know for sure. So there is a bit of uncertainty epidemiologically. But the two biggest factors are India imposed one of the earliest and harshest lockdowns of 2020. And it was absolutely brutal. A lot of people suffered, but there's no doubt that prevented the surge of COVID-19 in India for the first 2/3 of 2020. The other factor that I think people forget a lot of the time is India is an incredibly young nation. So we know that COVID-19, one of the biggest ways it discriminates is actually by age. So for every decade that the population is older, the mortality rates are, about, roughly speaking, kind of 10 times higher. So the median age of an Indian person is about 27. For Australians, it's 37. In Italy, it's 47. So we can expect totally different patterns of hospitalisation, etc. But when you've got a critical mass of people who are sick, and with those issues that panel leader is talking about, just the kind of issues in terms of social mobility and infrastructure, when it's going to spread, it's going to spread. So India came out of its lockdown in 2020, but I think the reason why we're really seeing surge now, I would argue from what I've spoken to relatives there, my family's been affected and reading the news, incredible political hubris in October. This idea that I'm quoting, that India has defeated COVID-19 to the extent where there's kind of hubris looking at Europe going, we should have done kind of what we've done. Complete destruction of the concept of social distancing and actually encouraging people to congregate in the early months of 2021, and this disease spreads.
And I guess what, you with a personal connection to the country could inform our listeners of is just what the realities of this is for the everyday person.
Yeah, so, well, I'll put it this way. I don't think there's a single person of Indian extraction you could find in Melbourne who doesn't have a family member back in India who isn't affected. So you can imagine what the situation is like in India right now. Certainly there were cases of oxygen literally running out and people dying. Not just one or two people. You'll just hear of a cluster of 20 deaths in this hospital because there was just no more oxygen left. And so inevitably it means probably thousands of people really have been affected by this. But it's just difficult to get a hospital bed. That's another issue. It's impossible for people to do a kind of self-imposed lockdown because you still have to attend work. These are the economic realities of India. The only people who can afford to shelter at home are people who have the money and the means. But mobility is a big issue in India. Lots of people live with their families, large families, and you have a lot of workers coming in and out of the home. And a lot of those workers, there's just no chance of them kind of social distancing and stopping work. So what that means is even for families who are so-called sheltering and social distancing, there's still someone coming in and out of the home every day who's essentially kind of a vector for this virus. So the only real solution now is waiting for the government, I think, to promote a bigger message of sheltering at home and vaccination. But until then, it's just a bit of an inevitability I think people have just kind of accepted right now.
And it's just crazy. Like, as an Australian doctor, and the idea of a hospital running out of oxygen, it's not only something I never thought could happen here, it's just something I have never thought about. Like, it's genuinely so foreign to me that you could run out of oxygen.
Isn't it funny? We were talking about, you've got to have medications and dexamethasone, remdesivir and ventilators, but the thing to put into the ventilator, you're right, I never thought about it as a medication. And I think oxygen really sums up one of the tragedies of the Indian response where actually quite early on in India, this was raised as an issue in India that we need more oxygen plants, that we'll need about 150 extra ones. And this was raised very early in 2020. By the time the second surge happened, only 5 were operational. Now, on one hand, you could argue, well, India's got its economic challenges and, not everything is possible in the first world countries is possible there. It's not just that. The tender to build these oxygen plants was only put out by the government in October, after it was raised all the way back in February and March. So, yes, there are some difficult realities of delivering high-quality healthcare in a country like India, but so much of this just comes down to a leadership failure.
There's an article in the BMJ caught my not a peer review article, one of just their website articles, was taking a look at what was going on, and the authors of that article were pointing to 2 really curious paradoxes. One of them relates to the way that the general public is relating to access to medicines and doctors' prescriptions and stuff that is associated with regulation. I'll come to more detail in a second. And the second paradox was the fact that there are, unlike we were just talking about with Stephen, where in Australia we aren't producing vaccines, there are actually 7, mega pharma. I mean, India is a massive pharmacological supplier to the world. There are 7 producing vaccines and producing pharmaceuticals that are relevant to treatment. And that is not getting into circulation to the extent that it, you would expect it to when it's so local. And it points to something that could only be explained by political, what would be the generous term? Negligence?
Negligence would be generous even. I mean, it's a lot of the issues with vaccines was that, obviously not a production thing, but just the way that some of these deals were done. So I think even in early January, the Serum Institute of India, which is the biggest producer, was actually asking for some funding from the federal government. They just need the capital to obtain the raw resources, and that was kind of not granted at the time. It's only really when the surge really started going that money was allocated very late. But you had this bizarre point, I think, in the pandemic where the CEO of the Serum Institute of India, this massive vaccine producer, tweeted out to Joe Biden asking for the release of several raw materials that were embargoed by them. Now, that was a bit of a contentious issue. You say having those embargoes on the raw products, and that was reversed. But it was just curious to me that the CEO had to resort to tweeting out the president directly, and that tells me that the back channels were not working well. That the farm company did not have confidence in the Indian administration to do the kind of hard work to help make these things happen. So, for a country who's producing a heck of a lot of vaccines, there were a lot of issues in terms of price control and allocations and deals and raw materials being produced. And it really does just come down to the political will and leadership and level that which leaders were wishing to be involved, which was really not very much.
On the point of vaccines, now, India is known for producing a lot of pharmaceutical goods and for producing vaccines. Are vaccines available to the general public? Are they available to healthcare workers, or is it simply that they are available, but the vaccine hesitancy in the country is high? Like, what's the story behind why this country isn't getting vaccinated?
So look, that's a really good question, and there's a bit of everything you've kind of mentioned. So firstly, there is a cost attached to vaccines. I'm sure there are some free programs out there, but in terms of my family members who got a vaccine in India, they certainly had to pay for it. And again, if you're middle class, it's not expensive, but most of India is not middle class, and it is very expensive for them. And especially when you're a young worker, you don't immediately see what the benefit of the vaccine is going to be. I've had COVID; it wasn't too severe. You'd think to yourself, "Well, what would be the point of my family getting it?" So there's a lot of that issue going on. There's been distribution issues as well. Certain states getting less than other states. Certain states with vaccines sitting in their fridges. Now, what I find fascinating about this is that if I just didn't use the word India there, you would think we were talking about actually potentially any country. It's just that what we're seeing is that it's magnified because it is, as Panel Beta said, the largest democracy in the world. It's just every problem we're familiar with times 10.
Yeah. That we were just starting to allude to the politics of the matter. Perhaps it's now timely to address some of the misinformation that politicians themselves are putting out there. So in the scenarios that we've been describing, we might reasonably expect politicians to try and bring in a calming influence, and the equivalence of the chief medical officers bringing in a calming influence. That's not what's happening though, is it, Dr. Sharma?
Well, this is why, Panel Beta, when moments ago you said the word negligence and you said perhaps too generous, it is too generous. I mean, it's just almost psychopathic.
Yeah.
Some of the advice we're seeing come out. So the Indian health minister, I've seen these tweets, is just tweeting out immune boosting diets for people who've got COVID-19. You've had people very high up in the Indian administration who are telling people this is about roughly 1.5 months ago not to be crybabies about the situation. And one of the things that we've seen under this particular federal government in India, they're quite nationalistic, and so they've really platformed this concept of complementary and alternative medicines through this ministry called Ayush, AYUSH, and it's this the kind of idea behind this ministry is to kind of further enunciate the effects of yoga, Ayurveda, homeopathy, and all these other kind of traditional medicines. And proponents of this have been making some really awful statements about how you can prevent COVID-19 through these. You've had government ministers amplifying these messages. To do that, before the surge could be put down to just incompetence and lack of knowledge, but to do that during the surge, I mean, it almost really feels like a bit of kind of political misdirection. Just that classic thing you see of, I suppose, when there's a crisis, that you see bad leaders shovel the responsibility and onus onto the individual. Well, this is what you should be eating, not this is what we should be doing. And simultaneously, not mentioning masks. There's still no consistent masking kind of messaging and policy in India. So it's been negligent is too generous. These people do know better. The health minister of India is kind of doctor himself, and to see just the amplification of just nonsense diet cures, just speechless.
We've noted that Narendra Modi is a nationalist and a populist, and for people less familiar with Indian politics, you could put him in the same with some notable differences, but nevertheless very Trumpian, very, very similar to our mate over in Brazil. What do you reckon, and you've got the closest proximity, Dr. Sharma, what do you reckon explains why he's not intervening, being more interventionist in the stuff that other politicians are saying?
Look, the truth is I don't have enough knowledge of Indian domestic politics, but all I can say is I can't speak to his motivations. I really can't, and to a certain extent, I almost kind of don't care. I'm sure there is a very charitable interpretation that just relies on, the fact that he's, just not, just did not know and couldn't predict. But I think the least charitable interpretation is certainly that he will say nothing to sacrifice the concept of kind of political unity, and so much of his political rhetoric is all just around downplaying anything bad that's going on and look to the future. It's all going great. Yeah. It's going to be even better. Yeah.
Well, I'll have a crack. I suspect most obviously he just sees that there's electoral capital to be gained by the situation, and by letting the chaos and confusion occur at second tier politics below him, he can be seen to be above it, and so he's not feeling the electoral impact immediately. And when the time comes, and I suspect it will come, he can come in riding the white horse with some sort of coordinated effort when it suits him.
And if we'd been having this conversation 2 or 3 years ago, I would have been in shock. But this story is exactly the same one that we saw pre-US election last year, where I thought that the American populace would have more insight into their current situation, where Trump has been actively negligent in dictating how this pandemic is controlled, but he's still managed to get nearly 50% of the popular vote. Yeah.
It takes us back to our conversation with Bill Boytel 2 months ago, and where he was talking about COVID and any of the scenarios that we've just discussed, whether it be in India or closer to home, as being very political. And anyone who missed that chat with Bill Boytel, you are gently reminded you can go back on to the RRR website, rr.org.au, and listen on demand, or check it out on the podcast.
This is a podcast from RRR, an independent media organisation in Melbourne, Australia. RRR is listener-supported radio and receives no direct government funding. If you would like to financially support RRR by donating or becoming a subscriber, hit up rrr.org.au to find out how.
With scientists in mind, and my passing interest in a little bit of psychology and expertise, something caught my eye. And before I go directly there, I'm going to put it to you guys, Dr. Neo and Dr. Sharma. If by word association, if I say to you expert, what type of character do you think this person is?
Look, just from my own personal experience, it's more not personally as an expert, personally as in the people that I've been lucky enough to interact with. It's generally like type A personalities who are quite focused on their areas of interest and love what they do.
Yeah. Similar to you, Dr. Sharma?
Oh, yeah. Look, I can't avail myself of all the stereotypes we've all grown up with. Just books, glasses, introverted, head down, reading.
Yeah. And me too. Until just this week, I was casually reading some research that has been done on experts, and in particular Nobel laureates. A couple of researchers at Michigan State University delivered a lecture called The Value of Training as a Polymath for Stimulating Creative Insights Across Disciplines. So their motivation was to say that if you've got single-minded tendencies for your expertise, that's not going to bring out the best in you and what's possible. They actually said, they were theorising, and then the research later confirmed that the broader your interests, the more like the more productive you're going to be, the more diverse your work will be, and indeed the better the quality of work. And they were able to prove it. They went and looked at some significant longitudinal research done on Nobel laureates over a long period of time, and they mapped the publication record of Nobel laureates and found that no Nobel laureate only published in their own discipline. That's not terribly surprising, once you've got to that stage, you probably are dipping your toe in a few things. But they weren't just dipping their toe. They found that Nobel laureates were twice as likely as non-Nobel winning winners compared to just, Joe average expert, twice as likely to be publishing in twice as many different disciplines. And then they found that those just run-of-the-mill experts, the non-Nobel Prize winners, were twice as likely as any other, mid-career or not fully achieving academic in their disciplines. And they were therefore ready to make the conclusion that it was the diversity that created the quality of the expertise, not the single-mindedness that created the quality of the expertise.
And the way I'm reading this for us who don't have a Nobel Prize is that a bit of work-life balance is quite healthy, quite good.
Yeah, it seems that way. So, look, take that away for you, and you read into it what you will. Dear listeners, we've got to wrap this up. It's been wonderful having you with us. We want to thank our very special guest, Stephen Duckett, who was talking to us about the federal budget. And you can certainly, if you just came in a bit late to the show, definitely go back and, as I said a moment ago, go back and listen on demand or via the podcast. You might like to check us out on our social media. We're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, and we're on Facebook. And we really do welcome your comments and questions and suggestions for all sorts of things about the show. Really want to thank the sponsors coming back on board. We had a full list of sponsors again this week, and it really is fabulous that the sense of community coming back together again, and as regular listeners will know, most of our sponsorships are around events and local businesses, and this is a fabulous sign.
Hi, this is Panel Beater. Thanks for listening to the podcast of Triple R's Radiotherapy, a weekly radio show dedicated to health, medicine and well-being, broadcast live on Triple R from Melbourne, Australia, every Sunday. Hope you enjoyed the podcast. Feel free to get in touch with us via Radiotherapy's Facebook page.